Year 2, baby. Patrick Peterson is going to be a Viking again. We'll go over all of that as well as some interesting cap news and stuff and get you all caught up on where the Vikings stand, plus how all this Patrick Peterson stuff affects them in the draft. We'll talk about it here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. Ooh-wee!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal in the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day each and every day. Today on the show, we're talking about the big news, which is, of course, Patrick Peterson becoming a Viking, announcing that he's going to re-sign with the Vikings. It seemed like that deal was already kind of set up, but they let Patrick Peterson announce it on his own YouTube channel, which I guess would be a homie move, instead of the PR announcing it or leaking it to an Ian Rappaport or whatever. So that happened. He went on his podcast, which is on YouTube, All Things Covered. I think it's on like Spotify and stuff too. And they announced it live right at the top of the show. He had a Vikings hat and everything that he put on. He talked about how he's grown his hair out so that he's better equipped for the cold this year and all that. And then some about his like free agency experience and stuff. I always like listening to Patrick Peterson talk. I like their show. So he announces that, and then later the contract details come out. It is a 1 year, call it a $4 million deal. I believe there's a void year in it, and there's some incentive stuff that we will get to explaining. To make room for this, remember, we're kind of in this mode where we like make a dollar, spend a dollar, and the Vikings do seem to have a bunch of functional cap space right now, though a bunch of that's going to go to the draft and contingency and stuff, so they're not quite as flush with cash as it looks like on, say, overthecap.com. But they do have enough to do this deal, in part because they finally processed Adam Thielen's restructure, which actually pays Adam Thielen more money. So it's not a pay cut or anything like that. A lot of people were saying like, oh, hometown guy, way to give the discount now that you're getting old. Nope, he got more money. It wasn't much more money. It saves, he got a big old signing bonus that saves $5.2 million against the cap, I think is the number. And then he now has cap hit of $19 million next year and $21 million the year after that, and then a void year at the end of it, which kind of helps even it all out. So that's the way that Thielen's contract now works, and that more or less pays for Patrick Peterson's contract. I want to talk about Patrick Peterson's contract now because it is comprised of $2 million in base salary, which is all guaranteed, $1.5 million in signing bonus, which is also going to be all guaranteed. And then if there is the void year, that would spread out. So only half of it paid this year, $750K on next year. And then $500K in-game or per game roster bonuses, which we talked about with the Zadarius Smith. It's the same move where he gets, I think it evens out to like $30K a game that he plays. And then how that actually counts on the cap is how many games he played last year. So he played, I think, 14 games last year. So 14/17 of that $500K count against the cap. It's all a bunch of nickel and diming. That's only really for the nerds that are really into that stuff. But it means that about $100K gets deferred to next year. So a little less than $1 million gets deferred to next year for that. And then he also has $1 million available to him in incentives. He talked about taking a smaller deal this time and saying, hey, I'm not trying to back up the Brinks truck. I know I'm not 25, 26 anymore, and it's more about being somewhere where I can be happy and be myself and blah, blah, blah. And it is smaller contracts, fine. And it seemed like he really chose to come back to Minnesota because he was happy. He did have some interest from the Chiefs and Cowboys. He chose to come back to Minnesota because I think part of it is, the relationships he had with teammates like Cameron Dantzler, Chris Boyd. He's working out with Chris Boyd right now. And he and Cameron Dantzler FaceTimed right after, and they were really excited. So there's, I think, a camaraderie there. He doesn't have really much coach familiarity, though. I mean, when he came last year, it was because he wanted to work with Mike Zimmer. And he thought, hey, Mike Zimmer's famously had gotten a lot out of older corners before, and I want, some of that treatment. Zimmer's gone, and so is all of his coaches. So is any real connection that he has with the staff. We thought that he was that his old DB coach from Arizona was going to join the Vikings, ended up taking a bigger job with the Jaguars. So it's all about the people, the teammates, and the facility. And I do think the facility had something to do with it. and I think maybe a sense of like unfinished business. So obviously this makes me want to draft Derek Stingley a bunch because I just want the LSU corner mentoring the LSU corner. That just makes me happy. I don't know. You have to afford me that. I'm a Vikings fan and I'm just going to get mushy about it. But it also, I think, has an effect on the way we approach the coming offseason. We have a slot and start corner now. I don't know if Patrick Peterson's going to be any bit the player he was last year. Obviously, once you cross 30 for cornerbacks, that cliff can sneak up on you, and he'll be 32 when the season starts. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be bad, though. And we'll talk about kind of how he can overcome the decline in athleticism. And he has already experienced some decline in athleticism. So we just kind of have to talk about how that's going, how he can overcome it, how he overcame it last year, how he can overcome it this year. Obviously, we got to figure out how he's going to fit into the scheme. I mean, every scheme needs corners, so it's not as different as it is for a player like, say, Danielle Hunter or Eric Kendricks, where the job's going to be like a lot different, or a player like Dalvin Tomlinson. But what we're starting to see here is a very similar strategy to the 2021 strategy. And I caped for it in 2021. So I kind of feel like I'm a little bit obligated to give it a chance here, even though obviously that didn't work out. So I could just learn a lesson and say, maybe it'd be bad this time. But no, I think I get it. This isn't going to break the bank. And Zadarius Smith will break the bank next year, but they can get out of it really easily if they want to. And there's a lot of signings like this, the Jesse Davises of the world that are a $3 million deal. It's kind of a lot of Sheldon Richardson size signings, or Bashad Breeland if you want one that'll really make the people mad. But look, a mentor figure that can bring those young players along, that can help that corner room develop. There are going to be young corners starting. There's no two ways about that. Either a rookie or Cameron Dantzler or Chandon Sullivan, who's only 25, or even Chris Boyd. These guys are all very young, and having a mentor that can kind of bring them up is, I think, is pretty cool, even though our defensive coordinator is a DB's guy. So these guys are going to get a lot of attention, and I think that's a good thing for all of their development. And look, I'm not 100% giving up on Cam Dantzler either. I think he fits really well in a system like this that wants a lot of press and jamming and stuff. That's really his skill set. And I don't think Zimmer trusted him enough, and he didn't trust himself enough to really get the most out of that. But I digress. Let's talk about Patrick Peterson and his age, and then let's talk about the draft and all that stuff and how it sort of affects things. But first, let me talk to you about Grambling. The U.S. men's soccer team just qualified for the World Cup, as I'm recording this, so congrats to them. And you can bet on all of that stuff, or you can bet on what's left of the basketball tournaments. It's March Madness. You can bet on baseball futures, pro basketball, or hockey, or football futures too. You can start to bet on who the draft picks are and stuff. Whatever it is you want to gamble on, you can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.net. Use either their player prop builder. You can do all sorts of wacky parlays there. I know y'all love that kind of stuff. Or you can even go and bet in the middle of a game on what you think the outcome is going to be. Is there going to be a turnaround or not, or whatever? You can bet on that stuff too. So head on over to betonline.net and get yourself a Grambling. BetOnline, where the game starts. So this is the elephant in the room with Patrick Peterson. He's old. He's old. He's an old guy. And that's not, you don't want old. Old's bad. Over 30, launch that guy into the sun, right? I'm being facetious here. But the problem that people are going to say is look, this guy isn't a long-term solution. We need a long-term solution. And we do need a long-term solution. There is a sense that getting Patrick Peterson, I think, does help you in your quest for that long-term solution. Even if he starts in front of that guy for a little bit, that can be a helpful thing. That can be a good thing. I don't want Chris Boyd going out there and getting torched. I don't even think that's very good for his development. But on a more basic level than that, which I do want to get back into, he's got to play. Patrick Peterson has to play. And so how do you overcome that age when your athleticism starts to decline? And what I guess the short answer here is he's got good technique and he doesn't get crushed all that often. And when he's in pure man, he got crushed a lot in Arizona. The whole deal with him in Arizona, if you are new to this show, I talked about it a lot during that time, but if you weren't around, Arizona had him shadow, so he would follow guys all over and he would shadow DK Metcalf and Stephon Diggs and Terry McLaurin. And all of those players, those three in particular, really, really crushed him. And those three players would move into the slot, and Patrick Peterson would have to cover out of the slot. Minnesota did not do that with him, and it really, really helped. And most of the worst plays you got from Patrick Peterson came with him in man coverage in the slot. And he just didn't have the agility to deal with, Stephon Diggs in the slot. That's a tough matchup for anyone, let alone a guy who's well past their prime. There's also, Patrick Peterson, I think in 2019, was it, that he had a PED suspension. And then once he came off the PEDs, he wasn't the same player. And there's all sorts of kind of reasons to think now. He's like, there were a lot of reasons to think this dude's washed. He's not going to be the same player he was, either because the player he was due to juicing or because age meant he can't be that guy anyways. Either way, yet we had reasons to believe he won't be the same athlete. And I don't think he was the same athlete. He certainly wasn't perfect, and he gave up some plays. He also got an injury. He hurt his hamstring. He spent 3 weeks on IR because of that. That's the kind of thing that if you're pushing your body to a level that it can't handle anymore, you're going to have that. So you have to overcome your age. And when I say good technique, here's what I mean. Let's just go over some of the techniques. If you're playing press and you have good technique, it might not matter that the guy across from you is more athletic. And Patrick Peterson is going to experience this some. And not in the NFC North right now, because holy Christ, the NFC North has bad wide receivers. The Packers are going to get somebody. They're either going to draft somebody high or they'll pick up like a Julio Jones or something crazy. There's going to be somebody in Green Bay. They're not just going to let Devontae Adams leave and just like go with a bunch of nobodies. They'll go with one guy and a bunch of nobodies, which is their tradition. But whoever that guy is, Patrick Peterson's probably going to have to cover that guy a lot in those two very, very crucial games. You got like Darnell Mooney in Chicago, and I don't even know if Detroit has a team right now. They might fold as a franchise, but it's still, you've got other teams on the schedule. He's going to contend with good receivers, guys that are more athletic than him. So when you're pressing on that, when you have to play press man, you have to get a good jam on that guy. And part of that good technique is, having reach. Your arms don't get shorter as you get older, so he'll still have as much reach as he's always had. And an ability to really get up into a guy's face, really jam them. And if they're going to release really, really quick outside, you have to have not overcommitted. And Peterson's really good at all of that stuff. But I think really the best tool that he has in his toolbox is press bail. And that's lining up in a press alignment where you're looking like you're going to jam a guy. And when you're a wide receiver and you see, all right, the corner's going to jam me, you kind of want to release with some kind of move. You want to set something up. Watch Justin Jefferson play against press. He really sets stuff up and he takes steps, and it's very cool to watch. But it takes a little time to do that kind of thing. That's not you're spending a step, if you will, a step of time to swim past a guy and stuff. Some of these look like pass rushing moves. And you're trying to get past a guy, or Euro step past a guy, or do like what's called a hezi release, which is a particular footwork. These releases take a minute. So what you do is you line up in press and you make them take out of their toolbox, and that's going to take some time. And in that time, you turn around and you run the other way. And press bail loses really hard to like quick slants and stuff. So you need to only deploy it in certain situations and use your game tape. Be smart about when you deploy it. But again, Patrick Peterson has all the experience in the world, tons of great tape stuff. He knows this stuff and he knows how to navigate that. And if your technique is good, which again it is, you can get those hips flipped around really, really quickly, even if they're a little stiffer than they used to be, and you're not relying fully on fluidity. And then think about like a go route. That's where you're really worried about age, right? With the wide receiver streaking down the field as fast as he can, you're worried if Peterson can keep up. But with a good press bail technique, he can give himself an advantage and get rid of the biggest disadvantage corners are at, which is that they start out backwards. They have to run away other than the way that they are facing. And that's a really big disadvantage. And if you have good technique, you can get over that disadvantage and do better than other corners, even though you don't have the same athleticism. That's how he can overcome his age. I think that's how he overcame his age in 2021. He had, by all accounts, a respectable season. He was not a top 5 corner anymore. We're not paying him like he's a top 5 corner anymore. We paid him like he was a middle of the road corner last year. And I think he was about a middle of the road corner. And then this year we're paying him like less than that. And so the expectations are even lower. That is a thing that Kwesi has done with these. He's gotten a number of starters here, but none of them are really huge commitments. Kwesi has not been very committal. And I think that's probably a good thing. You're leaving your options open and stuff. Even with Kirk Cousins, that extension commits 1 more year to him. That's not nearly that's not as committal as I think what Rick Spielman was planning. If you ask me, this is totally a guess, but I think Spielman was planning a 2-year extension and Kwesi gave him 1. compared to his predecessor, at least a little bit less committal, if I'm right about that. At any rate, there is this world where if any of these players are bad, you're not in a terrible spot. And setting yourself up that way is, I think, pretty wise, and I think deserves commentary. I think this is a good signing, good value, good stuff. I love it. I'm really excited about it. But I think maybe my favorite aspect of it is the impact that it will have on the rest of the offseason. Even if Patrick Peterson's too old to play, him being in the building is going to change the Vikings' behavior and put them in a better situation than they were before when it comes to actually rebuilding the future of the roster. Having one guy, even if it's just for 1 year, can help you. Let me explain myself. We'll get to that in just a second. So there is, I think, a threshold that every NFL team, even the tanking ones, need to pass when it comes to this roster group or whatever. And it's don't be embarrassing. And I know that from a pure cold hard numbers, egghead kind of perspective, don't be embarrassing doesn't mean anything, right? That's an arbitrary thing. What is embarrassing? Is it losing by 10? Is it losing by 15? What's the points per game? What is embarrassing, right? And so it's not a really defined thing. And so when you talk about the analytics look on tanking, and how, well, it's better to, lose games, get a higher draft pick, blah, blah, blah. You're not going to win the Super Bowl anyways. That whole train of logic doesn't care if you're embarrassing because you're not trying to win this year. So who cares? Just close your eyes and sim the season, right? NFL teams cannot think that way. They just can't. The apparatus is built such that it relies on people who cannot think that way. It relies on players who have contract incentives and perhaps they're in contract years. They're trying to overcome, they only have so many years in the league. They're trying to maximize their earnings during it. Coaches really the same way. I mean, your average coach lasts 2-3 years. You're not going to blow one of them just to get a higher draft pick or whatever. And even GMs to some point aren't going to be as keen to do it because they know their leash. I mean, GM leashes are getting shorter and shorter too. It's not like back in the 80s when you'd have a GM who was there for 2 decades and that was kind of like your guy forever. These guys are getting fired after stints of 4 or 5 years, after particular draft cycles. So it's the NFL is the not for long league, right? And in the not for long league, you can't afford to spend 1 year just to marginally improve another. So because of that, you kind of have to paper stuff over if you don't have a long-term solution in the building. And corner is that way. This is a paper it over move. Right guard, Jesse Davis, is a paper it over move until you can get a long-term solution in the building or until you figure out that Wyatt Davis has actually secretly been good this whole time or whatever it is. So getting a long-term solution at corner, at both corner spots, is going to be a thing that takes time. You can't do that immediately. You can spend a couple draft picks, but that rookie's got to develop. Maybe you've got Cameron Dantzler, he's got to develop. Or if he has developed, you need to kind of go into this year to figure it out. And if he hasn't developed, you're going to feel like an idiot for doing that. So you have to have a papered over solution. And the threshold is don't be embarrassing. If you embarrass yourself, somebody gets fired, right? If this is the worst cornerback room we've ever seen in the league, you ain't keeping that job, DB guy. So DB guy is not going to be very interested in just letting the corners be bad all year, and we'll just go get our new guy and let him develop it. Make sure there's no veteran in front of him starting or whatever. So having Patrick Peterson in the building makes it so you cannot be embarrassing. He's not going to be, he might be a little older. He might be a below average corner. He might not be good enough for the position, and it might turn out to be a liability for the Vikings. That's there's a chance that this happens. And I think the contract reflects that the Vikings know that. But it's not going to be embarrassing. It's not going to be the worst cornerback room we've ever seen. It will probably not be as bad as last year's cornerback room was after Peterson got hurt. It probably won't be as bad as when they had Chris Boyd in, or even in 2020, it was worse. They had Cortria, Tankersley, and Dylan Mabin starting games. Probably won't be that bad, right? I would imagine it improves on those things. So you've crossed the threshold with this signing. Before you were at risk of being worse than that. Now you can kind of comfortably say, okay, at least we won't be embarrassing. And now that we won't be embarrassing, we can turn our eyes to the long term. This isn't going to be a headline, So now we can say, all right, who do we draft? And before, you might have to draft somebody who absolutely has to start because otherwise it's Chris Boyd and he's not good enough. But if you believe that Cameron Dantzler can be cornerback 2 and Patrick Peterson can be cornerback 1, that's probably a bottom half cornerback room to me, but it's not embarrassing. Then you can bring in a guy that maybe needs to learn something but has more athleticism. You can open up your draft board a little bit. you don't necessarily have to draft a corner first round. I still think that's the best option if somebody is available. If Derek Stingley's on the board, I still like that, I think, more than most other picks. Or if Sauce Gardner falls, it sounds like he won't, but if he does or something like that, or if there's another corner, if you really like Andrew Booth or something and you're willing to take him at 12, take him at 12. Don't let this stop you. Absolutely, for sure. But if something else happens, what if Chris Olave falls and you want him, and you're like, let's get one of these Ohio State kids because they're on the board and let's just get them. And we've got our heir apparent to Adam Thielen. We've got 4 good wide receivers now. This is going to be a sick offense. You go get him. And then you're sitting there in second, third round wondering where you're going to get a cornerback. You can do that under the pretense that, hey, and this guy's going to have a leg up developing because he won't necessarily have to start right away and Patrick Peterson will be in the building. That can affect the way that you view your draft board in a way that opens up your options. And more options is always good. If you open yourself to an option that turns out to be a bad option and then you select that one, opening yourself up to the option wasn't the problem there. So for me, more options always good. And this opens up more options. But I think I have to then talk about the sort of rebuildy tanky thing that a lot of people are talking about like, hey, why does a move like this, why do the Vikings make a move like this when they're supposed to be transitioning into something else? This is more of the same. What gives, right? And of course, we all kind of thought that when Zimmer and Spielman got fired, it's a new beginning. We're turning the ship around. We're going to do something else. And then it's kind of been a whole bunch of the same stuff. Re-signing players, extend the quarterback and like bring back free agents that were here last year. The goal is not to commit the most resources to rebuilding. The goal is to build the best team and build the best team this year, build the best team next year and the year after that, right? Well, the 3-year kind of angle at this. And anything beyond that, you can't really predict stuff about what's going to happen. So it's to have the best team over the next 3 years. This helps this team, inarguably, right? Patrick Peterson, better than Chris Boyd. We know this. It helps next year because it helps you draft the next corner. It helps you take a little bit more of a patient approach. You don't have to be in a panic. You don't have to overpay. It can help you in leverage too. If you're going to go out and sign another corner, and shoot, they might go out and sign another corner. That corner can't say, and I know you need me really, really bad. So how about you tack another $1 million on there? Cause I know I've got you over a barrel. You need a corner so bad. That is a better negotiation position. It's a better position to draft from. It's a better position to sign from. It's a better position to acquire players from. So if your goal is to improve the Vikings long-term or short, and if it's not, I have a lot of questions for you. But if your goal is to make the Vikings into a good team, being in a better position to do that is a good thing, even if Peterson himself isn't part of that long-term plan, because who knows how many years he has. He did say on his podcast, though, that he wants to play 3 more years. And he's playing the first one here, and we'll see what happens for the other 2. But hey, if you are sitting there going, well, they're not competitive for the next 2 years, but 2024, they'll be competitive. Maybe Peterson's part of that team too. And it depends on how he ages there. It's not outside of the cards. Either way, this puts the Vikings in a better position, both to not be embarrassing and to improve the long-term outlook of the team. And with a $4 million contract that, like, worst case has like less than $1 million dead next year, unless he hits a bunch of incentives that I don't know what they are yet. But like worst case, $2 million, like that's not going to break the bank either. It's going to have a marginal negative impact on next year. And I think a really big positive one. It's just a harder one to measure, but we still have to acknowledge that. So all of this is to say, great stuff, Quasey. We love it. We're happy. We love Patrick Peterson here, and we're partying. Za'Darius Smith, Patrick Peterson. The last 2 weeks, we've gotten 2 different reasons to party, and that rules. Keep it coming, Quasey. We love it. I owe you guys a whole bunch of prospects of the day. So unless more news breaks, I might do 3 prospects tomorrow and just have that be the show, or we'll do something else. I don't know, but we'll talk about it. I will see you all tomorrow. In the meantime, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. Check out Locked On NFL on YouTube. You can find me there on Tuesdays. I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, Skol.